The victory of the indigenous peoples at the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, though a moment of triumph, ultimately led to even greater suffering and loss for them in the years that followed. The U.S. government, shocked by the defeat, responded with a renewed and relentless campaign to subjugate the Plains tribes. Determined to crush any further resistance, the government dispatched more troops to the region, launching a series of aggressive military actions that culminated in the forced relocation of the indigenous peoples to reservations. This marked the beginning of the end for the traditional ways of life that had sustained these communities for generations. One of the most devastating blows to the indigenous way of life was the systematic slaughter of the buffalo, a key resource for many Plains tribes. The buffalo provided food, clothing, shelter, and tools, forming the backbone of the Plains economy and culture. However, in an effort to weaken the tribes and force them onto reservations, the U.S. government encouraged and facilitated the mass killing of buffalo herds. Hunters, often driven by the demand for buffalo hides in the east, decimated the population, leaving millions of carcasses to rot on the plains. By the late 1880s, the buffalo were nearly extinct, and the indigenous peoples, deprived of their most essential resource, were left with little choice but to accept the government's terms and move on to reservations. Life on the reservations was a harsh and often dehumanizing experience for the indigenous peoples. Stripped of their ancestral lands and confined to often barren and inhospitable areas, they struggled to maintain their traditional cultural practices. The reservations were designed to isolate and control the tribes, breaking down their social structures and forcing them to adopt the ways of the dominant American society. Government agents, often corrupt and indifferent to the needs of the indigenous peoples, imposed strict regulations on every aspect of life, from food distribution to religious practices. Traditional ceremonies were banned, and children were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools where they were forced to abandon their languages and customs in favor of English and Christianity. The Dawes Act of 1887 further eroded indigenous culture and autonomy by dividing communal tribal lands into individual plots. Under the guise of promoting assimilation and self-sufficiency, the Dawes Act parceled out land to individual indigenous families, with the remaining land sold off to white settlers. While U.S. reformers believed that this policy would help integrate indigenous peoples into American society, it was a disaster for the tribes. The land allotments were often too small to support sustainable agriculture, and many indigenous families, unfamiliar with the concept of private property, lost their land to speculators and creditors. As a result, millions of acres of tribal land were lost, further impoverishing the indigenous communities and weakening their cultural cohesion. The final blow to indigenous resistance came at Wounded Knee in 1890. In response to the growing popularity of the ghost dance, a religious movement that promised the return of the buffalo and the disappearance of white settlers, the U.S. government feared another uprising and moved to suppress it. When the Army attempted to disarm a group of Lakota Sioux at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota, a confrontation ensued, resulting in the massacre of nearly 300 men, women, and children. This tragic event marked the end of organized indigenous resistance on the plains and symbolized the complete defeat of the indigenous peoples in the face of U.S. expansion. By the turn of the century, the indigenous peoples of the plains were unable to fight back successfully against the overwhelming military and political power of the United States. Their traditional ways of life had been systematically destroyed, their lands taken, and their populations decimated. The relentless push for westward expansion and the imposition of American culture and governance had effectively erased the frontier as it had once been known. As the frontier closed, Americans became increasingly aware of the end of an era, recognizing that the vast, untamed wilderness that had defined the nation's identity was now a thing of the past. The destruction of indigenous ways of life remains one of the darkest chapters in American history, a stark reminder of the cost of the nation's expansion and the enduring impact of those years on indigenous communities.